The fuck I am. I am not. Conquered is not stolen, but is not stolen. Plus, don't act like you weren't conquering land and raping each other. Like, these indigenous tribes were just terrible. And they were defeated by a much superior culture, civilization, and thanks to Europeans, they actually started living in peace and living in a civilized society. People wouldn't have to be afraid of walking in the street.
In 1620, the Mayflower ship left Plymouth, England with 102 passengers who sought the New World for religious freedom. By winter, they arrived in Massachusetts Bay, but the harsh winter caused many deaths from disease, starvation, and extreme conditions. Although roughly half the pilgrims had died out, the rest were fortunately helped by some native tribesmen who spoke English. The most famous of these helpers, Squanto, taught the pilgrims how to live in a new environment by growing corn, extracting sap from trees, catching fish in the rivers, and avoiding poisonous plants. Since the pilgrims' lives had turned around, they decided to hold feasts to thank God. During it, their native allies, the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit, joined them, resulting in what is often considered the first Thanksgiving.
You may have heard that the first Thanksgiving took place in 1621 and was a peaceful sit-down between members of the Wampanoag Nation and the Pilgrims.
After Puritan settlers from Massachusetts Bay Colony spread into present-day Connecticut, conflicts with the Pequot people of southeastern Connecticut set off the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638. After Endicott attacked and burned several Niantic villages on Block Island, followed by a Pequot village along the Connecticut River, the Pequots retaliated with a string of raids on English settlements that persisted into the spring of 1637. With an eye on eliminating the Pequot threat once and for all, Endicott organized a large military force. The Puritans and their native allies set fire to the Pequot's fort at Mystic before slaughtering upwards of 500 to 700 men, women, and children in less than an hour, although many scholars believe the death toll was far higher than that.
Handi tam dedin handi iko.
A second slaughter took place on June 5th near present-day Stonington, while a third slaughter took place on July 28th near present-day Fairfield, effectively ending the Pequot War, as well as the majority of Pequot people. Of the 3,000 Pequots living in Connecticut prior to the Mystic Massacre, at war's end, an estimated 200 Pequots remained alive. Of the survivors, most were sold into slavery, making the Mystic Massacre one of the bloodiest events in early colonial history.
Like James Monroe, the guy who gave General Andrew Jackson the green light to chase Seminole Indians and runaway slaves into Spanish Florida. And at first glance, it might look like a messy border dispute. But then you remember, this is Andrew Jackson, a one-man wrecking crew. 'Cause he didn't just chase. Jackson torched villages, executed native leaders, and even worse. While he wasn't looking, his troops accidentally massacred the Chihawk, a peaceful Native American tribe they mistook for enemies. Yeah, not great. Even Jackson was shocked when he heard the news, so much so that he ordered the arrest of the militia leader behind the attack. However, the dude skipped town and disappeared. Sir, he went that way! Meanwhile, back in D.C., President Monroe tried to walk a fine line. He didn't exactly endorse Jackson's chaos, but he did sign off on the broader invasion of Florida. 'Cause by 1819, the U.S. ended up owning the state, largely thanks to Andrew Jackson doing what Andrew Jackson does. And even though the term war crime didn't exist back then, massacring civilians on foreign soil, yeah, that checks a lot of the boxes. But if you think Jackson's death toll stopped once he became president, think again. 'Cause in 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, a law that forced Native American tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole off their ancestral homelands. The plan was to relocate them west of the Mississippi River, and the result was the Trail of Tears. where thousands of men, women, and children were marched at gunpoint across hundreds of miles. Between the freezing temperatures, disease, and lack of food, it's estimated anywhere from 4,000 to 15,000 died along the way. But somehow, it gets even more twisted. Cause the Supreme Court already ruled that the Cherokee Nation had the legal right to stay on their land. But Jackson said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Sheesh! He just ignored the Supreme Court. And by modern standards, historians across the political spectrum agree on what this really was. Ethnic cleansing. So, did Jackson's successor come in and put a stop to it? No, not even close. Because Martin Van Buren picked up right where he left off, fully committed to enforcing the Indian removal policy, which led to another 4,000 Cherokee deaths. And at the same time, the Second Seminole War was raging in Florida, where U.S. troops burned villages, killed civilians, and chased Seminole families through swamps for years. But here's the thing with Van Buren. He was more of a status quo guy than an ideological mastermind. He just kind of went with the flow. Either way, enforcement of ethnic cleansing is still, ethnic cleansing. But speaking of brutal crackdowns, this next president might catch some people off guard. Cause Abraham Lincoln authorized the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Yeah, Honest Abe. It was 1862, and the U.S. Dakota War had broken out in Minnesota. Dakota warriors, pushed to the brink of starvation due to delayed food payments, began attacking settlements. And the bloodshed was staggering. They killed between 400 to 800 civilians and soldiers. No! Don't go toward the light! U.S. soldiers were furious, so they quickly put hundreds of Dakota men on trial. And in the end, 303 were sentenced to death. But there was one big problem. The trials were a mess. Most had no legal representation, and some lasted just a few minutes long. So President Lincoln stepped in and personally reviewed the cases. And even though he reduced most of the sentences, Lincoln still approved the execution of 38 men. Those he believed had clear evidence linking them to murder. And the execution became a public spectacle. Cause all 38 men were hanged at once in front of a crowd of 4,000 people. Now, to be fair, Lincoln was under enormous political pressure from Minnesota settlers demanding justice. And he did cut down the number of executions from 303 to 38. Some historians argue that, in doing so, he saved lives. But others point out those trials weren't real trials. And by today's standards of due process, this would be considered a war crime. Kinda like what went down with Ulysses S. Grant, who rolled out what he called a peace policy toward Native Americans. But, spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly peaceful. Cause in 1868, the U.S. signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, which guaranteed the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills. But then gold was discovered there, and suddenly the treaty didn't seem so convenient. So Grant ripped up the deal and let miners flood in anyway. Sir, I don't think that's a great idea. That move sparked the Great Sioux War of 1876. Oh, and even before that war broke out, there was the Marias River Massacre in 1870, where U.S. troops killed 173 Pekin Blackfeet. Most of them women, children, and elderly. Grant didn't know about it until after the fact, but still. Sir, this is happening under your watch. Between the treaty violations, forced relocations, and civilian massacres, Grant's peace policy looked more like a war strategy. But then came Wounded Knee with President Benjamin Harrison, which is probably 10 times worse than anything Grant ever did. Cause in 1890, the Ghost Dance movement was spreading across the Lakota, a spiritual practice that the government feared might spark an uprising. So the 7th Cavalry moved in to disarm a band of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek. And what happened next was a massacre. As soldiers were in the process of disarming the Lakota, a deaf man named Black Coyote hesitated to give up his rifle, and it accidentally discharged into the air. At almost the same moment, a few young Lakota warriors threw aside their blankets and fired back with concealed weapons. But this was obviously a deadly mistake, cause most of the Lakota were already disarmed. So it was open season, and between 150 and 300 Lakota were killed, many of them women and children, gunned down while fleeing. Benjamin Harrison called it a battle, but historians have consistently called it what it really was, a massacre. But it gets even crazier, cause 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their actions that day. Medals that, as of now, have still never been rescinded. Sheesh. It's one thing to commit a war crime and try to bury it, but to hand out medals afterward, that's a whole new kind of messed up.